With regards to MDG6, when it comes to HIV and AIDS, I think we've seen really uneven progress in different countries on how they are achieving these targets. Malaysia, for example, achieved every other target except for MDG6, which caused great consternation, which is good because then it stimulates people to try and achieve more. But I think what's important to note is that MDG6 cannot really be separated from the other MDGs because they all concern women, concern health, etc. It needs to be seen as a whole, that if you achieve the others, you ought to be able to achieve MDG6. At the same time, if you want to do MDG6 properly, then you also have to do the rest properly. In terms of HIV as a whole, I think the UNAIDS report that just came out says that there has been a decline in new infections globally, which is good. However, there are still people getting infected, and therefore there still needs to be a step up in prevention responses throughout the world, particularly for women. Malaysia, for instance, just released some reports saying that although overall our infection rates are declining, among women it is in fact increasing, and it's now up to 18% of new infections compared to 0 10-15 years ago. And this is a big worry, of course, because the impact of AIDS on women is significantly more than if just on men, simply because women are, central to families, communities, etc. And so there will be an impact on children and etc. So I think we still have some way to go in achieving not just MDG6 but all the others as well, because as you know, they're all related. I think the most difficult aspect of HIV to deal with in our part of the world particularly is the human rights dimension, because there's a belief somehow that most people don't even see the human rights aspect of HIV/AIDS. Secondly, there's the belief that human rights is a Western idea, and it should not relate to Asian societies because it does involve, for instance, the human rights of people of different sexualities, drug users, sex workers, etc. All these people have to be considered human, and therefore they have rights just like everybody else. So it's been very, very hard to convince people that this issue is important when what you get back is that, oh, this is against our culture, our traditions, our religions, etc. But without approaching HIV from a human rights approach, there is almost no way, I think, of managing it at all, because when it comes down to it, all these different groups of people, all these people who are marginalized by society are human beings. They are vulnerable because we don't treat them as human beings and because we don't uphold their rights. So from people who work in HIV, it's as simple as that. But we're up against very conservative religious, political establishments that simply don't want to talk about it or simply will not recognize. There are some, some glimmers of hope because there are some people, I think, within the political establishment, within the religious establishment, for instance, in some of the countries who are, beginning to accept that human rights is important. I think we're starting off really with women's rights. Women's rights, I think, is gaining a lot of traction, and from there, we're trying to link to the other ideas of, the human rights of all the other groups through reproductive and sexual rights. So there is some hope, but I think it's very slow going, and while it is slow going, our ability, our capacity to deal with HIV will always be limited. I think women in political positions in around ASEAN, on the one hand, it's something that we are used to in a way, because there are, there have been several women leaders, women presidents, that sort of thing. The problem is really in terms of numbers, and numbers count. We've had a single woman president, and then hardly anyone coming up to replace. I think that the issue really is about replacement. For instance, in Malaysia, we are always holding up the governor of the central bank, the chairman of the Securities Commission, who are both women, as the example that women are doing well. The issue is always who is coming up next. And if there are no women coming up next, then we haven't actually succeeded. There is no successive generation of women coming up to take these places, along with men, not to say that we are excluding men completely. The issue is always, again, unwillingness by men to allow women to come into these positions. There is some belief that women cannot lead and should not lead. But again, the reality is that it is the men who have to adapt. Women in the political parties are numerous. They're very often doing all the running around, and especially during election time. And I think sooner or later they're going to demand their voices to be heard more, because I think with a new generation of girls who don't feel that they have to always take a back seat, things will have to change. It is going to be slow, and I think in the meantime, I think it is really important that there are affirmative action measures taken. We have all signed up to CEDAW, and CEDAW, one of the actions that's supposed to be taken is to reserve 30% of decision-making positions for women. And different countries have taken this on one way or another. In Malaysia, there hasn't been real talk about it, but some actions have been taken. For instance, there is a proposal on hand that has to go to cabinet on the 30% in Malaysia. However, the Ministry of Women is not pushing it that hard, simply because she's unsure of the support that she will get. It's interesting that the men who most push for affirmative action on a race basis are not keen to do it on a gender basis. So they believe that affirmative action is good for one thing, but not for another thing. So it's a contradictory type of thinking. But I think it needs to be done, because it is really important to have the numbers in Parliament, for instance, to push for more measures that benefit women. It is, I think, unconscionable when we have 50% of the population female, and in Malaysia, for example, in Parliament we only have 15% women, in Cabinet only 2 out of 29, and they're both in sort of soft ministries. I don't think it reflects reality at all. Women are increasingly making, the major decisions in community lives, in their family lives, etc., and coming up in jobs, in the career. So I think politics particularly has to adapt to that reality in order to meet contemporary needs of society. Why does a gender gap exist? Patriarchy, I think, is the short answer. Men have been in power for so long, they're really unwilling to give up that power, even though realities have changed. One of the realities is education, for instance. Women are getting more and more educated, more and more women are getting educated. We are seeing now in universities, a majority of students nowadays is female. In Malaysia, it's 60%. And therefore, it stands to reason that they are going to a demand more, say, you know, take up more jobs and really take their place in the world. What is stifling them, what is limiting them is really structures and laws that have been set up by men who are not facing the reality of this. There's a very interesting article written by Hannah Rosin, provocatively titled The End of Men, which really studied what is happening in the US, where there is a real disparity between the way men and women are viewing the world and how women are actually adapting more to current economic circumstances, where we are relying more on knowledge, information, and so-called soft services, which women are much more able to do, rather than the sort of industries which require the brute force of men. And women are realizing this. They are studying the type of subjects. They are bettering themselves through all sorts of education in order to take up these jobs. Men, on the other hand, are not adapting, even where there is affirmative action to balance the genders. For instance, in nursing, there is affirmative action to get more men into nursing, but men are just refusing to go. And so they are left with nothing. And their attitudes towards education is very different from women. In Malaysia, I mean, nobody has really studied this, but I suspect one of the reasons why there are more girls in the universities is because they do see education as a step to freedom. At least for the 3-4 years that they are in university, they are on their own, they are away from families. They do have some freedom. They don't always adapt to it very well. All sorts of issues with young girls, you know, away from home and being vulnerable to all sorts of things. But they do take it much more seriously than the boys, and then getting frustrated because when they go out there into the job market, then they are seeing all the barriers to women advancing. Some of it, though, is a natural, what do you call it, some of it is that people have no choice anymore as to who they employ because there is a larger pool of girls. For instance, in the civil service, there's a lot of women, and women are just rising to the top simply because there are no men rising to the top. We've recently celebrated the appointment of 2 women judges in the Sharia courts, which is in many ways a great leap forward. In terms of thinking, in terms that women can now be judges in Sharia courts in all issues. But at the same time, I think it remains a fact that in the legal services, in the Sharia legal services, there are simply more women anyway. So they really had no choice. But eventually they just have to choose from a pool of women rather than a pool of men. So this is something that policymakers are really not adapting as fast as they should. The fact that women, whether they like it or not, women are rising. On the other hand, you also have very conservative forces that are always trying to push women back and keep them in their places, and it's being done through all sorts of means, particularly through the media. For instance, in Malaysia, in the dramas that you see on TV, in the very, very popular novels, which always have a religious foundation to them. The idea of the good Muslim woman particularly is the one who always obeys the husband, who always looks to husband's needs, etc. and all that. This sort of subtle messages, I'm afraid, is really going to be the thing that keeps women down, because it creates that sort of mentality where despite their academic achievements, they're still going to hold themselves back. And this is something that we have to fight.